This video discusses the key themes around which Silent Hill: The Short Message bases its story. The short message puts a heavy emphasis on dark themes such as suicide, depression and abuse. Those themes will be discussed in this video, so I'm adding this content warning so you can choose to skip this video if you prefer. Oh, and this video contains full spoilers for the ending of the game. Now, with all that being said, let's proceed to this in-depth look at why the themes in Silent Hill: The Short Message are so important. What is a theme, and why is it important to the games that we play? Well, the theme of a game is comprised of a few different things. Tone, the basic parts of our brain the game will attempt to stimulate. For example, a game with a light tone will attempt to engage in distracting activities, but a game with a heavy tone will aim to make us think. After the tone, there's the concept of the game, meaning the basic emotions that the writers are attempting to make us feel, i.e. happiness for a more quietly reflective game, or sadness for a deeper, more emotional game. After concept comes direction, and that's where the more nuanced parts of the theme development begin to form. Direction is what must be decided before writing things like characters, and where they fit in, as direction is where the sort of tale the writers wish to tell begins to take shape. Say the developers are seeking to make a game with a medium to heavy tone, with a concept in mind of a game made to make the players happy, but also a bit reflective. The direction is where the developers will decide exactly what they were going to target to make that happen, such as hope or bittersweetness. That leads to the last stage of theme development, which is the plot, where the writers decide exactly how they're going to make the players feel and understand the direction of the game, with plot devices such as characters, events, and locations. A theme is more important than any other part of the game, and that's because it was once said that there's nothing worse than a game that makes the player feel nothing. Even a game that reaches for something but fails in areas in the plot can partly succeed due to a strong thematic root, but a game that makes you feel nothing is worth nothing. Of all the objective ways that we can describe games, none are more valid than talking about whether the game makes you feel something. Of course, there's a reason I'm telling you all this, and it's because Silent Hill: The Short Message has been thoroughly criticised for the execution of its theme since its release last week. Many reviews have had strong words to say about exactly why the themes are poorly executed here, but chief among them are accusations that the game is held down by cringy dialogue and cliché representations of bullying, and that the teenage characters are melodramatic. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions on games, and I strongly disagree with any statement claiming that there's a truly objective way in which to describe a game. That being said, I do believe that these criticisms of the game's theme are wrong, and there are a fair few reasons as to why. I'm going to break down these reasons into several sections, being empathy, subtlety, reality, and audience. These sections will be looking into various criticisms of the short message's theme, aiming to find out exactly why those criticisms exist, and underlining exactly why the themes present in this game are so important. Make sure you stick around until the audience section, as that's where I'll really be digging into the importance of the presence of the theme shown in Silent Hill: The Short Message. Oh, and if you've watched for that long, you may as well subscribe. It's worth it, I promise. Let's get started. Empathy is possibly the most important thing to consider while playing a game set around themes such as mental health. Silent Hill: The Short Message tells a condensed story of around 2 hours long, all revolving around the mental health struggles of two teenage girls, Anita and Maya. Anita's other friend is also involved, but to a far smaller extent. As the story entirely centres itself around these two troubled girls, your capacity to appreciate the story will more than likely revolve around your ability to understand what they're going through. As this is the case, it stands to reason to assume that this game was made for those that would be able to empathise and understand the troubles of Anita and Maya, and possibly compare those experiences to their own experiences. That's why it's truly baffling to me that so many reviewers haven't hired reviewers that have done this. The lack of empathy has been absolutely astounding to me. Let me read you a quote from GameSpot's review of The Short Message. Rather than paint in vibrant colours to create something poignant that both spooks its audience and carries its intended message to the finish line, the game feels like a fire hose with two settings: platitudes and nonsense. It's interesting, because not only does the reviewer say this, but it completely contradicts what they say in the previous line, which is, there's a kernel of something worth exploring here, but it has to be done deftly. So, Essentially, the reviewer wants the developers to explore the themes of suicide and depression, which Silent Hill does, but it also wants them to explore those themes both deftly and in vibrant colours. Those would sound compatible to you. To me, they sound like polar opposites. It appears that GameSpot's reviewer wants Silent Hill the Short Message to explore its themes both quietly and loudly. Of course, it's easy to put this down to a writer aiming to create an impact by using words they believe will have an effect, or not entirely using those words in the right way, but that doesn't seem to be exactly like the deft touch they desire so much from Konami. I believe that the themes explored here in the Short Message are obvious, and designed to be so. This isn't a game that seeks to shy away from its dark themes. This is a game that seeks to shine a light on them. It's why I have such a huge problem with so many of the reviews I've read. To go back to the GameSpot review, they finished by describing the Short Message as desperate to be understood, as if the game only put such a strong emphasis on its themes as to force an understanding on its players. I think that this description is not only incorrect, but devoid of any empathy. This isn't a game throwing its message in your face, it's a game that's telling a story from the perspective of two very vulnerable teenagers, and describing it in the way that GameSpot has is not only disingenuous, but it almost feels like an insult to those that will find a sense of relatability in Nita and Maya's experiences. Let's return now to how GameSpot expected Silent Hill the Short Message to discuss its theme. Let's talk about subtlety. Subtle is a word that belongs nowhere near games that attempt to shine a light on suicide and depression. That's because neither suicidal thoughts nor depression is subtle to the real people who suffer from them. When we make games or tell stories that deal with these themes, it's absolutely not the responsibility of the developers to tone them down in order for the players to feel more comfortable. There are always trigger or content warnings preceding these games. It's up to the player to decide whether they're comfortable enough to play them. Silent Hill the Short Message succeeds when many reviews say that it fails, in candidly telling a story from the perspective of a depressed teenager whose friend has recently committed suicide. There's very little reason I can think of as to why this should be subtly told, as I'm sure that it wouldn't have felt subtle to the girl in the story. I'm using the word subtle so much because almost every single one of the negative reviews about Silent Hill the Lost Message used the lack of subtlety as a reason to negatively review the game. It wasn't even just in the reviews where I saw the word being used. Last week I published my own review of the Short Message, which I'd heavily recommend you go and watch so that you can see my broader thoughts on the game. By the way, if you have watched that video, thank you very much. It's hugely appreciated and it did really well. I was very proud of my work on it. But my point is, I read all my comments in all my videos, and I noticed that while a solid 90% of my comments were positive, almost every one of the other 10% either gave nonsensical reasons as to why the Short Message was bad, or they complained about a lack of subtlety. I'm also going to point to a review published by Metro for this. Here's a quote. "The Short Message has no time for subtlety and is clearly very nervous about handling its serious subject matter. Attempting to address such issues is brave, and the game doesn't come across as insensitive, but it does feel shallow and obvious." Let's talk about some of the wording here. Nervous? Shallow? Obvious? Let's start with my issues with the apparent nervousness of the Short Message. This game is absolutely not nervous to tell its story in any way whatsoever. I would actually describe it as bold. It often hits the nail on the head, showing depictions of characters suffering from bullying and depression in which many people would have found similarities with their own experiences. I have no idea where the word shallow comes from either, as the ending alone isn't shallow, upending the opening monologue of the games to show how Anita has learned through her experiences how important companionship is while her head is in a dark place. It goes through her experiences of child abuse, how pain can be hereditary, and how her demons follow her throughout the villa. I'm shocked that this word even made it into the review. And obvious? Why shouldn't it be? Go back to where I mentioned the very dark things we see through Anita's eyes. Do any of those things sound subtle, or like minor details to you? They aren't, and therefore are perfectly allowed to be obvious. The issue here is that so many people expect these sort of games to tell a toned down story of poor mental health. They want a clean, romanticised version of depression, where the teenagers are well spoken and adult-like, and never cringy or childlike in any way. Unfortunately, that's not how depression works, especially in teenagers. It speaks again to the lack of empathy expressed by so many of these reviewers, and by so many players. Continuing on from this, I'm now going to discuss reality. why it's important to remember while playing this sort of game. To begin this section, I'm going to reference Polygon's review of the short message. Anita is a teenager, and teenagers can be annoying, so I didn't mind that her dialogue was sometimes very dramatic. But while depression can be all-consuming, the short message doesn't give Anita much more definition beyond her mental illness. This is why it's, in my opinion, a well-weighted review. It's negative, sure, I don't entirely agree with it, but it does note some very important points that so many reviews miss, while also noting exactly why the writer didn't like it. The thing that I'm going to point to that's important that so many fail to mention is that Anita's character is dramatic, and that's because depression can be all-consuming. So many reviews never once note this, they just note that there's a lack of subtlety in the game's writing, without ever explaining why that could be a bad thing, or why it's even a thing at all. The reality of depression is that it can be all-consuming, and that's not even thinking about what Anita must be thinking alongside this. It's explained later in the game through a dread-inducing sequence involving you experiencing Anita's childhood as a childlike version of herself, that Anita was regularly abused and neglected by her mother, who was also clearly heavily depressed. The story is told through journal entries, and it's clear to see that Anita went through hell as a child. Her mother did irreparable damage to her through neglect and her own selfish needs, and Anita essentially does the same to Maya. By hiding her letter out of fear of losing her friends, Anita ultimately begins a chain of effects that leads to Maya committing suicide. She feels the grief of that decision heavily, and holds a tremendous sense of guilt throughout the game. If we add this to the knowledge that Anita is also heavily depressed, then we can infer that her head must be an absolute mess. It's no wonder then that we find her in a negative headspace, with her guilt literally chasing her as a Sakura covered monster trapped in her own head. I've seen this discussed so little in reviews, or in any discussion about the game, and it does make me question whether reviewers are at all sympathetic to the reality of how difficult it would be to live in someone like Anita's headspace, having lived through what she has. My current thought is no, not at all, and that concerns me, as it shows a huge lack of empathy and sympathy, which is essential to reviewing these sort of games. Let's wrap up part 2 of my Silent Hill the Short Message review by talking about the audience. To sum up what I think about the discourse surrounding Silent Hill the Short Message, I'd say that I'm disappointed. Games like these that discuss mental health so openly are hugely important. So much popular media dances around the subject, preferring to dramatise the issue and make it more appealing to its audience. But who exactly does this actually appeal to? Those who have no concept of a struggle with mental health, or those who don't understand it? I'm going to emphasise something now, and I'm going to make it very clear. That's not the main audience we should be targeting when we make games about mental health. The reason why representation and the reason why the themes throughout Silent Hill the Short Message are so important is because it provides real-world sufferers of these conditions someone to relate to. So many people go through these awful struggles with their mental health feeling completely alone, and games like this can do a lot to remind these people that they're not alone, and that there is a way out. Look at the ending of The Last Message, for example. We shouldn't be applauding games for including references to mental health issues if those games are going to be downplaying them and making it seem like those issues don't matter. They matter hugely, and games that can make them seem of lesser importance can actually have a negative impact on the people who suffer from them. Imagine seeing in a piece of popular media that what you suffer from doesn't really matter that much, or that it can be brushed aside like it's a common cold. Candid stories about people who struggle do really matter, and that's why games like Silent Hill The Last Message are important. And that's why, even though I don't think it's completely perfect, I'm glad that it exists. Let me know what you think about what I said in the comments below. Remember to subscribe and click the like button if you enjoyed, and I'll see you all tomorrow for my review of the new PS Plus game of the month, Foam Stars.